It was the crisp wind of early autumn that stirred up the old memories. The kind of wind that bent the wheat fields and sent the scent of freshly turned soil into the lungs. In the small town of West Pine, Iowa, the past was buried as deeply as the roots of the old oak trees lining the farm roads. But for Jacob Tyler, the past had a way of returning, especially when it knocked on the door in the form of an old, forgotten letter. Jacob, 58, stood at the counter of his modest farmhouse, staring at the piece of yellowed paper in his hand. His weathered fingers traced the handwriting, crude, scrawled in haste, like someone trying to send a message before they knew their time had run out. The letter had been found beneath a pile of old farm equipment in a shed that hadn't seen much use since the early 90s, a relic of a time when Jacob's brother, Daniel, had still been alive. Daniel Tyler had vanished 18 years ago, without a trace. No one knew what happened. His truck had been found parked at the edge of the Tyler family's old cornfield, the engine still warm, but he was never seen again. The sheriff had ruled it an accident, some kind of tragic disappearance, but Jacob had never believed it. His brother was no fool. He wouldn't just drive out into the field and disappear. He wasn't the kind to run off or hide. Jacob's gaze shifted from the letter to the small stack of photographs on the counter, each one taken years ago. His family, the farm in its prime, his brother standing beside him, laughing in the sunlight. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, the farm was run down, the fields were overgrown with weeds, and the barn was slowly falling into disrepair. His brother was gone, and so was the spirit of the place. Yet, something about this letter, it made Jacob's heart race. The letter was addressed to Daniel. The writing was shaky, almost frantic. "I know what they're doing. Don't let them finish it. Get out of here. You're not safe. Don't go to the silos." The mention of the silos was enough to make Jacob's blood run cold. The old silos on the property had been there since before he was born, towering structures that once held the grain of their prosperous farm. They had been abandoned for years, ever since the last harvest failed. But the letter's warning made it clear that there was something about those silos, a secret that someone wanted to keep hidden. Jacob folded the letter carefully and shoved it into his coat pocket. It was time to find answers. Time to go back to the old farm, to the place that held more than just the memories of a family, but the dark secrets of the land itself. He had never trusted the sheriff's explanation. People around here had been tight-lipped, and Jacob had learned long ago not to trust anyone when there was something to hide. As he made his way outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the land. The wind had picked up, carrying the whispers of long-forgotten voices, of stories that had been buried under layers of dirt and time. Jacob climbed into his truck, its engine sputtering to life with a familiar roar. The drive out to the old farm took less than 10 minutes, but in that short time, Jacob felt as though the years had fallen away, and he was back in his prime, working the fields beside his brother. The farm, though run down, still held a kind of majesty in the fading light. When Jacob arrived at the farm's edge, he parked his truck near the silos. The place looked unchanged, like no one had touched it in all these years. The tall, rusted silos stood like sentinels, their metal exteriors worn and peeling from the harsh winters. The ground around them was trampled, as if something, or someone, had recently been there. Jacob's heart beat faster. It was almost as though his brother was still here, watching from the shadows. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the dry ground as he made his way toward the silos. The wind howled through the rusted metal, making an eerie sound. A chill ran down Jacob's spine, but he pressed on. This was where it had all started. This was where Daniel had disappeared. As he approached the base of the silos, he noticed something odd, a fresh set of tire tracks leading away from the area. The tires were large, industrial-sized, the kind used by farming equipment or trucks. Jacob frowned. No one had been around here for years, not since the place had been abandoned. Who could be out here now? He knelt down, brushing away the dirt and debris, revealing something half-buried in the earth. A small, metal object. It was a key, rusty and old, but unmistakable in its shape. It was the kind of key that would fit a padlock, the kind used to secure something important. Jacob's hands trembled as he picked it up. The letter had been right. There was something here, something hidden. And now, with this key in his hand, Jacob felt the weight of the mystery that had haunted him for so many years. He didn't know what he would find, but one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away now. Jacob stood by the old silos, clutching the rusted key in his hand. The cold breeze swept through the dry grass, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down his spine. The key was an odd thing to find, especially after all these years. It seemed to call to him, like it belonged to a forgotten door, a door that had been locked away for far too long. With one last glance at the worn-out silos, Jacob slipped the key into his coat pocket and made his way back to the truck. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows over the farmland as if the land itself were trying to hide the secrets buried beneath its surface. He could feel the weight of those secrets pressing on him, and he knew that the key wasn't the only thing that had been left behind. There was something else, something that Daniel had left for him to find. Driving back toward town, Jacob's thoughts raced. The silos had always been a part of the Tyler family's history. They had been there before his birth, standing tall as symbols of prosperity and hard work. Now, they were crumbling, forgotten by all but the few who still remembered the old days. No one had come to this part of the farm for years, no one, except for those who wanted to keep things hidden. He reached the old farmhouse and parked near the front porch. The house looked almost like it had been preserved in time, with its peeling paint and sagging porch steps, but it was still the place where Jacob had grown up. He had spent most of his life here, helping his father and brother tend to the land, working through the seasons, living by the rhythms of the earth. Now, all that was left was the memory of those days, haunting the creaking walls and dusty rooms. Jacob stepped out of the truck and walked up to the porch, where he noticed something strange, a small object lying on the ground near the steps. It was a broken piece of pottery, chipped and worn from years of neglect. But it wasn't just any piece of pottery, it was part of an old vase that Jacob recognized from his childhood. He remembered it clearly. It had been in the living room, a family heirloom that his mother had kept on the mantel. But now, it was broken, scattered on the ground like an old memory forgotten. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand, noticing a faint symbol etched into the surface. It was a simple mark, one he had seen before but couldn't quite place. The symbol was like a twisted vine, curled around itself in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random. Jacob felt a coldness creep over him, a sense that something was terribly wrong. Walking into the house, Jacob made his way to the living room, where he stopped in front of the mantel. Sure enough, the vase was gone, the empty space where it once stood now a glaring reminder of what had been lost. The broken piece in his hand seemed to mock him, as if it were trying to tell him something. But what? Suddenly, the floor creaked behind him, and Jacob spun around. Standing in the doorway was Sarah Monroe, the town's librarian and one of the few people who had stuck around after the old days. She was in her mid-50s, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun, and her eyes were sharp, as if she had seen more than most could ever imagine. "You're back," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jacob nodded, trying to hide the unease that had crept up his spine. "I found something." Sarah stepped into the room, her gaze falling on the broken pottery in his hand. "I see. I thought you might." Jacob's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Sarah looked out the window, her gaze distant. "You've been looking into Daniel's disappearance, haven't you?" "I never stopped looking," Jacob said, his voice tight. "And now I found something. A letter. A key. A broken vase. What does it all mean?" Sarah turned to face him, her expression grave. "It means you're about to uncover things that the town has tried to forget. Things that no one wants to talk about." Jacob swallowed hard. "What do you know?" Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with her. "There's a lot more to this than just your brother disappearing. There's a reason why people around here don't ask questions, why they don't talk about what happened. You see, this town, it's been in the grip of something for a long time. Something bigger than you or me." Jacob took a step forward. "What do you mean?" "The land, Jacob," Sarah said, her voice low. "The farm industry around here, it's been changing. Slowly, over the years, but it's changed all the same. Big corporations bought up the land, and with it came secrets that go back decades. People like your brother, they didn't just disappear. They were pushed out. Or worse." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Jacob felt his heart race again. He had always known that something was off about the way things had turned out, but he had never suspected the depth of the conspiracy that might lie beneath the surface. It was clear now that the silos weren't just symbols of their family's past, they were part of something far more sinister. "There's a place," Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. "The old silos. They're not just a storage space. They're a holding place. And if you want to know the truth, you're going to have to go there." Jacob clenched his fists. "I will." Sarah met his gaze. "Just be careful. There are people who don't want the past to come back." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jacob standing alone with the broken pottery, the key in his pocket, and a growing sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The mystery of Daniel's disappearance was only the beginning. The deeper Jacob dug, the more he realized that the town, and the land, held a much darker secret than anyone had ever let on. The old silos stood like silent sentinels, their rusted metal frames casting long, crooked shadows across the ground. The air around them was thick with the smell of earth and decay. It felt as if the past itself had been buried beneath the soil, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to unearth it. Jacob stood at the base of the silos, his breath steady despite the unease that gnawed at him. The key in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with every step he took. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, like a warning, but also a challenge. He couldn't turn back now. Not when the truth was so close. He had spent the better part of the afternoon driving around the town, speaking to a few old acquaintances. Most had given him the same half-hearted answers, avoiding his questions or deflecting with their own concerns. But Jacob knew that they were hiding something. There was a wall of silence around this town, and he was going to break through it, no matter what it took. As the last light of day began to fade, Jacob made his way to the side of the silos. He had learned from Sarah that there was a maintenance door hidden in the back, one that had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. He had to believe that it was more than just a place for storing grain. The letter, the key, the broken pottery, it all pointed to this one place. He reached the maintenance door, and the key felt cold in his hand as he inserted it into the rusted lock. It turned with a stiff, grinding sound, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell that led deep into the earth. Jacob hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over him. It felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward, feeling the chill air of the underground space seep into his bones. The stairs were steep and worn, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. He descended slowly, each step an echo in the stillness, until he reached the bottom. The underground room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old wooden crates and barrels, most of them covered in dust and cobwebs. But it was the far corner of the room that caught his attention. A small table sat there, covered in papers, photographs, and a few broken pieces of machinery. It was a haphazard collection, as though someone had been in a hurry to leave. Jacob moved toward the table, his heart pounding in his chest. The papers were yellowed and faded, but some of them were still legible. He picked up one, his hands trembling as he read the words written across it. Experiment log. Subject number 12. Initial testing phase completed. No significant results. Begin phase 2 tomorrow. The words seemed harmless enough, but there was something about them that felt wrong. The phrase, subject number 12, stood out, as if it were part of something bigger, something more disturbing. He glanced over at the photographs scattered across the table. Some were of people he didn't recognize, others were of the silos themselves, taken from angles that seemed oddly deliberate, as if someone had been watching. But one photograph caught his attention in particular. It was a picture of his brother, Daniel. Daniel was standing next to an old piece of machinery, his face hard to read. He wasn't smiling, but there was something else in his expression, something that spoke of unease, of knowing something he shouldn't. In the background, Jacob noticed a shadowed figure standing just out of sight. The figure's face was obscured, but the posture, the way they held themselves, it was familiar. Jacob's blood ran cold. He turned the photograph over. There was a note written on the back, in Daniel's handwriting. Stay away from the silo. They're watching. They know. The chill in Jacob's chest deepened. This was it. Daniel had known something, something that had cost him his life. And now, Jacob was standing in the very place where his brother had uncovered the truth, a truth that had led to his disappearance. Jacob looked around the room, his eyes scanning the dusty crates and shelves. There had to be more. There had to be something else that would explain all of this. He moved toward one of the crates, pushing aside the cobwebs, and opened the lid. Inside, he found more documents, official-looking papers with government stamps and signatures. As he flipped through them, his stomach sank. They were agricultural permits, laboratory reports, contracts with major farming corporations. But the most disturbing thing was the name that kept popping up, Greenfield Enterprises. Jacob had heard the name before. Greenfield Enterprises was one of the largest agricultural corporations in the region, a company known for buying up small farms and turning them into industrial-scale operations. The company had a reputation for using questionable practices, and Jacob had always been wary of them. But these documents painted a far darker picture. Greenfield Enterprises wasn't just a company, it was a shadowy network, with ties to government officials, local law enforcement, and powerful people who had no interest in seeing their secrets exposed. Jacob closed the crate with a quiet thud, his mind racing. He had to get out of here. He had found enough to know that his brother's disappearance was no accident. It was part of something much bigger, something that went all the way to the top. But just as Jacob turned to leave, he heard a sound behind him, a faint scraping noise, like footsteps on the concrete floor. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The room was empty, but he could feel the presence of someone, or something, watching him from the shadows. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a voice rang out from the darkness. "You should have stayed away, Jacob." Jacob froze, his body stiff with fear. The voice that had come from the shadows was low and cold, carrying a warning in its tone. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it had the weight of authority, someone who wasn't just passing through, someone who had been here long enough to know what Jacob was doing and why he was here. "Who's there?" Jacob called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. The faint scraping noise continued, moving closer. Jacob's flashlight flickered as he clicked it on, but the beam of light only illuminated the dark corners of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, like something was hiding just beyond the reach of the light. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said again. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Jacob's heart pounded as he strained his eyes, trying to make out any form in the darkness. The words hung in the air like a threat, and he knew deep down that whoever this was, they had the power to stop him. But Jacob wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything he had discovered. He took a step forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "What do you know about my brother? About Greenfield Enterprises?" The room fell silent, save for the distant hum of the machinery in the background. Then, slowly, the shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the far corner of the room. The person was tall, their face obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat, but the figure's stance was imposing, their presence filling the space like an unspoken warning. Jacob's fingers tightened around the handle of his flashlight, but before he could speak again, the figure raised a hand. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Jacob," the figure said, their voice colder now, like the bite of winter wind. "Some things are better left buried. Your brother didn't just disappear. He got too close. Too many people, important people, have invested too much into this place. Into what we're doing here." Jacob took another step forward, determined. "What are you talking about? What's been happening here?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they seemed to be weighing Jacob, sizing him up. Finally, with a slow exhale, the figure stepped into the light, revealing their face. It was a man, middle-aged, with a sharp jawline and cold blue eyes. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket, his hands tucked in the pockets as though he had all the time in the world. But the way he looked at Jacob was anything but patient. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, and had done too much to be afraid. "I'm not here to explain everything," the man said flatly. "But you're right about one thing. There's a conspiracy. Your brother was getting too close to something he shouldn't have." Jacob's pulse quickened. This man, whoever he was about to reveal something crucial, something that could tie everything together. "Why don't you start talking, then?" Jacob demanded, his voice rough with frustration. "You want me to stay out of it? You think I'm just going to walk away from my brother's life, from the truth?" The man looked around the room, his eyes flicking to the crates, the photographs, the documents. Then he sighed, almost as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "Daniel found something," the man said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "Something Greenfield Enterprises doesn't want anyone to know. Something so valuable that they've built an empire around it. But it's not just about money. It's about control. Control over the land. Over people. And over secrets that should never see the light of day." Jacob clenched his fists. "What is it? What did he find?" The man's gaze hardened. "I'm not going to be your guide to a rabbit hole you can't crawl out of, Jacob. But I'll tell you this, your brother wasn't the first to go missing. He won't be the last. And if you keep pushing, you'll end up just like him, another name on a list of people who knew too much." Jacob's mind raced. He had been right. This wasn't just about his brother's disappearance. There was something much larger at play here, something that tied together the entire town, Greenfield Enterprises, and a web of power and secrecy that stretched across the land. "Who are you?" Jacob asked, his voice demanding the answer. He needed to know who this man was, who had been watching, waiting. The man gave a small, almost sad smile. "I'm someone who used to work for Greenfield. I've seen the things they'll do to protect their interests. To protect the truth." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. "You're a part of it?" The man shook his head slowly. "I was. Until I saw what they were really doing. And I couldn't stay silent any longer." He paused for a moment, his gaze hardening. "If you want to find the truth, you're going to need more than what's in these old crates. You're going to need to go further. To places where Greenfield's influence is still felt. And even then, the answers may cost you more than you're willing to pay." Jacob stood there, staring at the man. His body was on edge, but his mind was sharp. There was no turning back now. Not after everything he had uncovered. "Where do I go next?" Jacob asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The man looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, he gave a single, deliberate nod. There's an old farm outside of town. It used to be a test site for Greenfield's experiments. The land was sold off years ago, but the records are still there. Hidden. If you want to know what really happened to your brother, that's where you need to go. Without another word, the man turned and walked toward the back of the room, disappearing into the darkness once again, leaving Jacob with more questions than answers. Jacob stood there for a long moment, processing the man's words. His mind was a storm of thoughts and possibilities. But one thing was clear, the truth was far more dangerous than he could have imagined. And if he was going to find it, he would have to risk everything. He had no choice but to follow the trail. Jacob's truck rumbled down the narrow, dirt road that led to the old farm on the outskirts of town. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving only a pale, slivered moon to light his way. The shadows of the tall cornfields stretched like dark fingers toward him, reaching for his truck as if they, too, wanted to hold him back. But there was no turning back now. He was getting closer to the truth. The man in the silo had been clear, the farm was where it all started. The place where Greenfield Enterprises had conducted their most secretive operations, where the land had been used as a testing ground for something far beyond simple farming. The farm had been abandoned years ago, sold off after Greenfield's experiments were deemed too controversial, too dangerous. Jacob could feel the weight of those words pressing on him as he approached the overgrown property. The old farmhouse, now just a silhouette against the night sky, loomed like a ghost of its former self. Its roof had caved in, the windows were broken, and the paint had peeled away long ago. But even in its decaying state, it still had the power to evoke memories of simpler times, of days when the land had been full of life. He parked the truck near the fence line and stepped out, the night air cool against his skin. The sound of crickets chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the tall grass, but there was no other sign of life. The farm was as silent as the grave. Jacob walked toward the farmhouse, his boots crunching on the gravel. The moonlight illuminated the remnants of the old barn, its timbers broken and leaning at odd angles, as if it had been abandoned in haste. He paused for a moment, scanning the area. The farm was empty now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He moved toward the barn, the creak of the wooden boards under his feet echoing in the stillness. As he reached the entrance, he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light inside. The barn was filled with old, forgotten equipment, rusted tractors, broken tools, and piles of rotting hay. But in the far corner, something caught his eye. A large metal door, half hidden by the shadows, stood out like an anomaly. It was different from everything else here, it was new, out of place. Jacob's heart raced as he approached the door. The man had said the farm had been used as a testing site, and now, with the door in front of him, Jacob knew he was getting closer. But what was behind it? What had Greenfield Enterprises been hiding? He pulled at the rusty handle, the door creaking open with a loud groan. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and stale earth. The room was small, but it was clear that it had once been a place of some importance. A small desk sat in the corner, papers scattered across it, and the walls were lined with shelves full of old files. A dusty light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a faint glow on the room's contents. Jacob stepped inside, his flashlight flickering as he swept it across the room. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, many of them left open. He walked toward the nearest one and pulled out a folder, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. The label on the front was simple, Phase 3, Agricultural Research. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. The words on the paper were technical, detailing various experiments conducted by Greenfield Enterprises. It was all about genetically modified crops, corn, wheat, soybeans, but there was something more. Something darker. In one of the pages, Jacob found a report that described the use of human subjects, people who had volunteered to participate in trials, their bodies exposed to chemicals and genetic modifications in an attempt to enhance crop yields. The report was vague, but the implications were clear. Greenfield had been experimenting with more than just the land. They had been experimenting with people. Jacob's stomach turned as he read on. His brother, Daniel, had been onto something. He had known that the corporation wasn't just altering the crops, it was altering everything. People. Animals. The land itself. The folder dropped from Jacob's hands as his mind raced. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. Greenfield wasn't just trying to control the land, they were trying to control life itself. And his brother had gotten too close. Too close to the truth. Suddenly, a noise broke through the silence, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he quickly stuffed the folder back into the cabinet and moved toward the door. He needed to get out of there. He needed to get back to town and figure out what to do with this information. But just as he reached for the door, it swung open with a sharp creak. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Jacob froze. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward into the dim light, his expression hard and unreadable. He was dressed in a dark suit, the kind of attire that didn't belong in a place like this. "I was hoping you would come here," the man said, his voice low and calm, but carrying an edge of something darker. "You've been asking too many questions, Jacob. And we can't have that." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back. "You're with Greenfield, aren't you?" The man nodded slowly. "I was once. But now, I'm here to make sure things stay quiet. People like you, people who dig into things they shouldn't, they don't make it out of places like this." Jacob's eyes darted around the barn, looking for a way out. The man was blocking the entrance, but he had to find a way to escape. He couldn't let this be the end. Not now. Not when he was so close. "You think you can stop me?" Jacob spat, his voice full of defiance. "I've already seen too much. I know what you're doing." The man stepped closer, his expression unchanged. "You haven't seen anything yet. But you will. If you don't leave now, I can promise you won't leave at all." Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he made a split-second decision. He shoved the man aside and bolted for the side door, racing into the darkness. The sound of footsteps followed him, but Jacob was faster. The barn's creaky wooden floor gave way to soft earth, and he darted toward the truck, his heart racing. Just as he reached the truck door, a hand grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. Jacob swung, catching the man in the jaw with a hard punch. The man staggered back, but Jacob didn't stop. He jumped into the truck, slamming the door shut and gunning the engine to life. He could hear the man shouting behind him, but there was no time to look back. He sped down the dirt road, the truck's tires kicking up dust behind him as he raced toward town. His mind was a whirl of thoughts. He had uncovered the truth. He had the evidence, but he was nowhere near safe. Greenfield Enterprises was bigger than he could have imagined. And now, they were coming for him. Jacob's truck screeched to a halt outside the sheriff's office, tires kicking up gravel as he threw the gearshift into park. His heart was still pounding from the escape, the narrowness of it all gnawing at his insides. He barely registered the cold night air as he scrambled out of the truck, his boots pounding the pavement as he rushed toward the front door. The sheriff's office wasn't a place he'd ever expected to go for help, but he had no choice. He needed someone on his side, someone who could help him bring down Greenfield Enterprises. He shoved open the door, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts, and almost collided with Sheriff Harris, who was standing behind the front desk. "Jacob? What the hell are you doing here?" Harris's voice was gruff, but there was a sharpness to it, a caution that hadn't been there when they'd spoken last. "I need your help," Jacob said, his voice tight. "I've found something. Something that can bring down Greenfield. But I can't do this alone. They're coming for me, Harris. You have to help me." The sheriff's face hardened as he took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jacob's breath was still coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't wait for permission. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folder he had taken from the abandoned farm. He slammed it down onto the desk, his fingers trembling. "This," Jacob said, his voice low and urgent. "This is what they've been hiding. Documents on their experiments. They've been genetically altering crops, but that's not all. They've been experimenting on people, Harris. Using them as test subjects. And they've been doing it right here, in our town. Right under our noses." Sheriff Harris didn't move for a long moment. He didn't speak. He just stared at the folder, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for it. His fingers brushed the papers, and he flipped through them, his brow furrowing. "What is this?" he muttered, under his breath, as he scanned the documents. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter," Jacob snapped. "You have to take this to the authorities. They're already coming for me. I barely made it out of that farm alive. They'll stop at nothing to protect what they've been doing." Harris slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the small office. "You don't get it, Jacob. This isn't something we can just send to the feds. Greenfield Enterprises has too much power. Too many connections." Jacob's stomach sank. He could see it in the sheriff's eyes, the doubt, the fear. He had known Harris for years, but now it felt like the man was looking at him as if he were some kind of dangerous criminal, not the person who had uncovered a conspiracy. "I don't care about their power," Jacob said, his voice rising. "My brother is dead because of them. And they're still hurting people. They'll keep doing it if we don't stop them. Don't you understand that? They've been lying to all of us. For years." Sheriff Harris's hand trembled as he pushed the folder aside, and he finally met Jacob's eyes. "What do you want from me, Jacob? You're right about one thing, Greenfield has power. Too much power for a small-town sheriff like me to fight. Jacob's frustration boiled over, and for a moment, he felt like he might explode. He'd spent so long looking for the truth, putting himself in danger, only to be met with this resistance. But then, something clicked, something in the way Harris's voice had softened just enough for Jacob to see the crack in his resolve. "I'm asking you to stand with me, Harris," Jacob said, his voice quieter now. "You've known this town your whole life. You've seen the way they've taken it all away from us. Don't let them take any more." The sheriff didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up the folder once again, looking at the documents in his hands as if weighing the consequences of what would come next. Finally, he let out a long breath. "You're not wrong," he muttered. "This town, it's been in their pocket for years. But if what you're saying is true—" "It is," Jacob interjected, his voice firm. "It's all true. And I can prove it." Harris stood in silence for a long time, the weight of Jacob's words hanging in the air. Finally, he gave a single nod. "All right. I'll help you. But you're right. We can't do this alone. I'll talk to the other officers, get them on our side. But you're going to need more than just these documents if you want to take down a corporation like Greenfield. You're going to need hard evidence. Something they can't deny." Jacob nodded, relief flooding through him. Finally, he had someone on his side. "Where do we start?" Jacob asked. "The old farm's not the only place they've been working," Sheriff Harris said, his voice steady now. "There's a facility outside of town. An old processing plant that used to belong to Greenfield. No one's been in there for years, but I have a feeling they've left something behind. Something that can tie everything together. If we're going to bring them down, that's where we need to go." Jacob's heart raced. This was it. The final piece. The thing that could expose Greenfield Enterprises once and for all. He felt the weight of everything that had happened, his brother's disappearance, the danger he had faced, the countless hours of digging for answers, and he knew, deep down, that they were on the verge of something big. The road ahead would be hard, but it was the only road that mattered. Jacob and Harris stood side by side, the sheriff's hand resting on the handle of the door, ready to take the first step into a fight that would change everything.